Hey all, this is Reddit Oscar. On this channel we're doing short, spoiler-free videos every day until Shadow of the Erdtree. Today's topic is, what was George R.R. Martin's involvement in Elden Ring's story? This is a question that still lingers and is still talked about today. But at this point there have been lots of interviews with Miyazaki, and some with Martin, where they explain what Martin did. So, in Martin's own words.
I know that you've recently been a part of developing a video game, and it seems to me like it's sort of a natural fit for a fantasy fiction writer to work on a video game. How is that, different from what we know you for working on?
Well, it actually is considerably different. I've played some video games. I'm not a big video gamer, but the game is called the Elden Ring, and it's a sequel to a video game that came out a few years ago called Dark Souls, and it came out of Japan. My work on it was actually done years ago. These games, they're like movies. They take a long time to develop. Basically, they wanted a world created to set the game in. They wanted world building as a big factor in fantasy and science fiction. You're not only talking about the characters and the plot, but the setting is almost as important as everything else. Tolkien's Middle-earth, Robert E. Howard's Hyborian Age, the foundation universe of Isaac Asimov. I worked up fairly detailed background for them, and then they took it from there. So it's been several years since I've last seen them, but they would come in periodically and show me some monsters they designed, or the latest special effects, or the cool things. But the game has been very slowly developing, and now it's coming out in January, I believe. So I'll be as excited as anybody else to see it.
So the Game of Thrones.
So according to Martin, he created the world building, he compares it to Tolkien's Middle-earth and things like it. He created a fairly detailed background for them, and then they took it from there. Now as for Miyazaki, in an interview he's asked, what can you tell us about the creative brief you gave him before he set to work on the foundational parts of Elden Ring's backstory? In Miyazaki's own words, early on we established a very good level of respect between each other, both in our personalities and in the sort of work that we do. And this was really important in establishing that foundation for the game, because Mr. Martin respected the fact that we didn't want him to write the game's story or the in-game text, because we felt that would actually limit his creative output. And if he was limited by something that was already a game or already a concept in this way, then it would limit the inspirations we could possibly get from him. So, we established very early that he would be writing that foundation, that historical element to the game, something that took place long before the events of the game itself. And this way he was able to much more freely flex those creative muscles and provide something that wasn't restricted. Okay, so Martin did not write the game's story, and he didn't write any of the game's in-game text. He wrote the backstory from which From Software could draw inspiration. Miyazaki goes on to say, we started off by giving him these very vague and very broad themes and ideas for the mythos that I had swimming around in my head, along with what kind of game we typically make, and what sort of themes we'd like to explore in our games. So it was all very loose and quite vague. Then he would come back to us with a lot of ideas. How about this, this, and this? That back and forth started the exchange of ideas. So, Miyazaki provided to Martin a kind of prompt. Miyazaki told Martin what kind of themes they'd like to explore, and vague themes and ideas that Miyazaki personally had in his head. Martin took that prompt, and he would come back with lots of ideas that he would present to Miyazaki, asking how about this, or this, or this. And they engaged in this back and forth until they presumably had something they were both happy with. Now, in that same interview, Miyazaki goes on to say that it was all text. Rather than being a short story, it was something that depicted the setting or set the scene for the game and for the world, detailing the flow of history and the figures who appeared throughout it. There was a story that came with this as a sort of backbone, but it played as more of an introduction to that world and a natural course of events for these characters to follow. And this is what was given to me and the team. And then we were able to interpret this in our own way and provide the visuals to go along with that, and to build that into an actual game. A lot of the motifs that came from this and drove my creative thinking behind these elements in the game were connections between people, including parent-child relationships. A lot of the issues that Mr. Martin dealt with in his writings provided these motifs for the game itself, so that is something I'm very grateful for. So what Martin provided was a block of text that depicted the history and characters of the lands between before the shattering. For the most part, Martin stopped interacting with the team after this text was delivered, and Miyazaki says that once they had it, they were able to interpret this in their own way and use it as a source of inspiration. Now, we actually do know around at what point Martin's influence stops. We can infer it from several interviews. First, in Martin's own words. Elden Ring was going to take place in, let's say, the present of their game universe, but what they wanted me to write was what happened like 5,000 years before that. So I went back and wrote a history of what happened 5,000 years before the current game, and who all of the characters were and who was killing each other and what powers they had. They had these runes that were at the center of the game, and the rune got split up into many pieces, and that's what screwed up the world. I laid all that out. So from this we know that he made the characters and backstory up until at least the Shattering, and we can infer the rest from an interview with Miyazaki. In Miyazaki's own words, when Martin wrote these characters and when he provided that origin story, that mythos for the world of Elden Ring, these demigods were much closer to their original form, and maybe much closer to human form back then, before the Shattering, before it all started. So it was more up to us to interpret this and say, how did they become such inhuman monsters? And how did the mad taint of the shattered shards of the Elden Ring and its power affect them? So that was our job, to take these grand heroes and sort of misshape them and distort them into something they were not. And I think that if we get a chance to show Martin, and if he gets a chance to see the game and these characters, I think he might be shocked. When he wrote them, he was envisioning something a little more human, a little more traditional human drama and fantasy characters. So I hope he gets a kick out of that. The process of taking these very human characters with flaws, but very dramatic, heroic characters, and basically breaking them and making them into these misshapen, grotesque monsters, that was a lot of fun for me, personally. Alright, so what Martin wrote when it came to the demigods was very different than what we got in the game. They were dramatic, human characters with heroic attributes. And it was up to Miyazaki to envision, how did the power of the Elden Ring misshape them and turn them into what they are? So Martin doesn't know that Rykard is eaten by the Great Serpent. He doesn't know about Godric's grafting or Radon in the desert eating corpses. So different are they from what Martin wrote that Miyazaki thinks that Martin would be shocked if he saw what they're like in the game. Martin doesn't know about any of that, and that means that his contributions with the backstory probably end around the time when the Elden Ring was shattered. Martin didn't write the game's story. What he wrote was the demigods, their family dynamics, the history of the world, and maybe the events leading up to the Shattering. But he doesn't seem to know what happens after, and I think it's unlikely that he knows how the game ends. Anyway, that's the end of this video. As always, thank you very much for watching.